The dust storm howled across the barren planet, a constant reminder of the relentless, inhospitable environment. The human outpost, a crumbling fortress of rusted metal and scorched earth, was barely holding together. It stood on the edge of a jagged cliff, overlooking a desolate valley where nothing lived but sand and blood. Inside, the few remaining soldiers moved with practiced urgency, preparing for a fight they knew was coming, but didn't believe could be won. John Hawkins crouched in the darkened corner of the command room, his piercing blue eyes scanning the flickering readout in front of him. His breath was steady, each exhale a rhythm he'd perfected over countless missions. The screens displayed a grim picture. Varathian forces, elite, indomitable, and ruthless, had breached the outer defense perimeter. No one had ever beaten them in battle. The Varathians were creatures of myth, whispered about in hushed tones. The best soldiers humanity had to offer had died under their onslaught, their bodies torn apart by weapons that defied comprehension. But Hawk wasn't like the others. He wasn't afraid. "Sir," came the voice of Lieutenant Sarah Holt, sharp and clipped. She was young, still wet behind the ears, but tough as nails. Hawk had seen her fight in places where others would have crumbled. "We've got movement on the east side. They're getting closer." Hawk glanced up at her, then back at the map. His mind was already working, calculating, strategizing. The Varathians weren't just another enemy. They were the enemy, the best the universe had ever known. Their reputation was legendary, their tactics flawless. But Hawk had learned a long time ago that no one was invincible. "Set up the traps. I want them to think we're weaker than we are. We're going to make them pay for underestimating us." Sarah nodded, her face hardening with resolve. Hawk didn't need to say more. She'd been trained for this, trained to fight in the shadows, to adapt to any situation, to never give up. Together, they had survived more than one impossible situation. Today, they would do it again. The door to the command room slammed open, and Sergeant Jack Bull McCarthy entered, his massive frame filling the doorway. His thick beard and battle-worn face bore the scars of years in combat. He was built like a tank, but his mind was as sharp as any of Hawk's officers. "We've got about 30 minutes, maybe less, before they hit us full force," Bull said, his voice low but firm. "You sure about this, Hawk? We're talking about the Varathians. The best there is. They've never lost a battle." Hawk stood up slowly, his boots scraping across the cold metal floor. "We're going to change that. We fight smart, we fight dirty, and we fight with everything we've got." Bull gave a crooked grin. "Damn right." As Hawk moved to the small armory corner of the room, he pulled his combat vest over his shoulders and checked his gear. His rifle felt like an extension of his body, and the tactical knife strapped to his thigh was as familiar to him as his own hands. He'd fought with this gear across countless worlds, and it had never failed him. This time would be no different. "We need to get to the perimeter," Hawk said, his voice steady, unwavering. "Don't give them an inch. Let them think they've got the upper hand, but we'll be ready. We've trained for this. We've survived worse." As they made their way to the outer defenses, the sounds of the storm grew louder, deafening. The wind battered their faces, and the sand stung their eyes, but Hawk's focus never wavered. Every part of him was attuned to the environment, aware of every noise, every shift in the air. Hawk didn't just fight the enemy. He fought the world itself. And he won. They reached the perimeter where the rest of the team was already in position, their faces grim but determined. They knew what was coming. They knew it might be their last stand. "We'll hold them here," Hawk said, taking a knee behind a makeshift barricade. He scanned the horizon, eyes narrowing as he spotted the first signs of the Varathian approach. The unmistakable hum of their cloaked craft, the faint shimmering outline of their ships as they descended from the sky. "Get ready," he murmured. The tension in the air was palpable, like the moment before a storm. They were about to face the kind of enemy that turned men into legends, or corpses. The first explosion rocked the outpost, followed by another, and then another. The Varathians had arrived. Hawk's team opened fire immediately, but the aliens were already moving, their armor rippling with an energy field that made them almost impossible to hit. They weren't just soldiers. They were monsters biologically enhanced, genetically perfect, and heavily armed with weapons that defied human comprehension. But Hawk had something they didn't: the element of surprise. He gave a signal, and in a coordinated move, the team set off their traps. Mines detonated, sending blasts of shrapnel into the air, while hidden turrets unleashed hellfire at the alien troops. The Varathians reeled from the sudden assault, momentarily disoriented. For a brief, shining moment, they were just like any other enemy, vulnerable. But that moment didn't last long. The Varathians quickly adapted, their shields activating with a crackling sound that cut through the chaos of gunfire. They moved with surgical precision, their cloaked figures flickering in and out of sight as they darted from cover to cover, picking off human soldiers with ease. The air was thick with the stench of blood and smoke, the cries of the wounded echoing over the battlefield. Hawk wasn't just watching. He was thinking, calculating, anticipating. Every move he made was deliberate, designed to keep the Varathians off balance. He knew their tactics. He'd studied them, learned their patterns. He knew when to retreat, when to push forward, when to play the waiting game. One of the Varathian soldiers, a towering figure in black armor, locked eyes with Hawk. The alien's face, obscured behind a helmet, was unreadable, but Hawk could feel the intelligence in its gaze. This wasn't just another soldier. This was an elite commander, the kind that had led the Varathians to countless victories. The two men, one human, one alien, stood at opposite ends of the battlefield, eyes never leaving each other. Hawk could feel the weight of the moment, the pressure mounting. This was more than a fight. This was humanity's chance to prove that they weren't just cannon fodder, that they were capable of taking on the best the galaxy had to offer. Hawk smiled grimly, his fingers tightening around his rifle. "Let's see if the legends are true," he muttered, as the first of the Varathian Commandos charged forward. The battle raged on, a blur of fire and blood. Hawk and his team fought with everything they had, each move a calculated risk, each shot a reminder that this war was far from over. In the back of his mind, he knew this fight was just the beginning. But for the first time in his life, Hawk felt something else rising inside him, something that had been buried for too long: hope. And as the dust storm continued to rage, he knew one thing for certain. The Varathians had made a mistake. They'd underestimated humanity, and that mistake was about to cost them dearly. The human resistance might not win today, but they would make the Varathians bleed. They would make them remember why they should never underestimate a Green Beret. The wind howled louder now, almost as if it were joining the battle itself, sending waves of sand crashing against the outpost's battered walls. The humans inside, hardened soldiers and battle-worn veterans, fought not just the Varathians, but the very planet they stood upon. They were a small, determined force, outnumbered, outgunned, and fighting on a hostile world that seemed to conspire against them at every turn. But Hawk didn't care about the odds. He cared about survival, and that meant outsmarting the enemy, exploiting every weakness. "Commander, they're regrouping," Sarah's voice crackled over the comms. Hawk had learned long ago to trust her instincts, and right now, they were telling him that the Varathians were far from beaten. If anything, they were adapting, recalibrating, and preparing for the next wave. Hawk could feel it, the shift in the air, the subtle change in the rhythm of the battle. The Varathians weren't just attacking, they were studying. "Ready the secondary defenses," Hawk ordered, keeping his voice even. "They're going to try and flank us." Sarah's sharp intake of breath was the only answer. She knew it too. The Varathians never attacked head-on unless they were confident of their victory. They were baiting them, waiting for Hawk to reveal his position. Hawk crouched behind the remnants of a fallen wall, the shrapnel and debris from the earlier explosions still smoldering. His eyes scanned the horizon, every muscle tensed. He could see the first signs of movement, silhouettes darting between the smoke and sand, too fast, too calculated to be just a diversion. The Varathians were pulling back, but only to reorganize. They would be back, and soon. "Bull, get your team to the west side. They're coming from there," Hawk barked, never looking away from the shifting sand dunes in the distance. "Bull, The hulking sergeant responded with a grunt, but Hawk knew he didn't need to say more. Bull understood. The soldiers on the ground were part of a well-oiled machine, and each move was instinctive, calculated in the heat of battle. As Hawk scanned the terrain, his mind was already working, predicting the enemy's next move. The Varathians had a singular focus: total annihilation. They wouldn't waste time on anything less. But Hawk had seen their tactics before. This wasn't an all-out assault. This was a test. They were probing for weakness, looking for the moment when the humans would break. They wouldn't get it. "Sarah, Bull," Hawk said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "This isn't just a fight for survival. It's a message that humanity could stand up, fight back, and even win against a superior foe. It wasn't just about holding the line anymore. It was about proving a point. And Hawk wasn't about to let the Varathians forget that." Suddenly, the sky lit up with the unmistakable streaks of incoming fire. The Varathians weren't waiting for the perfect moment. They were going to hit hard and fast. Hawk swore under his breath as he dove to the side, narrowly avoiding a blast that tore apart the concrete structure he had just been crouched behind. The explosion sent a wave of heat and dust that stung his skin, but he didn't hesitate. He was already moving, pulling Sarah down with him as the shockwave reverberated through the air. "Move! Now!" Hawk shouted. There was no time to think. The Varathians had started their counteroffensive. The battle had shifted from skirmishes to full-scale warfare, and Hawk knew he had to react before it was too late. His team scrambled to their feet, sprinting toward the secondary defenses, but the terrain was difficult, the sand shifting beneath their boots, slowing their progress. "Watch the high ground," Bull yelled as he raised his rifle, scanning the area for any sign of movement. The Varathians were notorious for using the landscape to their advantage. Always higher, always faster, always just out of reach. Hawk's eyes never left the horizon. He could see them now, cloaked figures moving swiftly between the rocks. It was a flanking maneuver. The Varathians weren't just attacking. They were cutting off their escape routes, forcing the humans into a chokehold. Hawk's mind raced as he formulated a counterattack. "Sarah, you take the North Ridge. Bull, I need you to lay down suppressive fire from the west," Hawk ordered, his voice clipped with authority. "I'll hit them from the east. We need to force them into the kill zone." Sarah and Bull didn't hesitate. They split off, moving with precision, like they had done 100 times before. Hawk knew they could handle it. He trusted them with his life. But even as the two soldiers took their positions, Hawk knew something else. The Varathians weren't like any enemy they'd faced before. They were calculating, relentless, and far more intelligent than anything the humans had anticipated. As Hawk crept through the sand, his rifle at the ready, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He knew the Varathians had advanced cloaking technology, but they weren't as stealthy as they thought. The ground shifted beneath him, a subtle vibration that his trained senses could feel even through his boots. He dropped to one knee, his eyes darting across the horizon. There, just a flicker, a faint shimmer in the air, too subtle to be seen by the naked eye, but visible to him. Hawk's breath caught in his throat as he aimed and fired in one fluid motion. The alien dropped to the ground, its body crumpling under the impact. The others would be close, but Hawk wasn't waiting around to find out. He sprinted toward the ridge, where Sarah's rifle fire was already echoing in the distance. He had no time to look back. The Varathians were closing in, the sound of their weapons charging reverberating through the desert like a death knell. Hawk's pulse quickened, the adrenaline kicking in. This wasn't just about fighting anymore. This was about survival, about proving that humanity could not be crushed so easily. "Hold the line," Hawk shouted into the comms, his voice fierce. "They bleed just like we do." The world around him seemed to blur as he charged toward the ridge. The Varathians weren't just a threat. They were a symbol, a test, and Hawk was going to pass it. He knew they would take losses, but that didn't matter. They had to keep pushing forward, to fight smarter than the aliens thought possible. The moment of reckoning was close. They had one chance to make the Varathians understand that Earth wasn't just some backwater planet to be conquered. and Hawk was going to make them pay for every inch they thought they could take. As the first explosions rang out from the ridge, Hawk fired again, this time with lethal precision. The alien forces were closing in, but they would never see him coming. He was already thinking 3 steps ahead, calculating every move, knowing that this battle, this fight, was just the beginning. The Varathians thought they were invincible. Hawk was about to prove them wrong. The ground shook with the force of the blast, sending ripples of dust and debris into the air. The earth beneath Hawk's boots cracked and splintered as the shockwaves reverberated through the outpost. He ducked behind the reinforced wall, heart hammering, as the screams of his men filled the comms. He could hear the urgency in Sarah's voice, the familiar grit in Bull's gruff commands. But above all, he felt the tightening knot in his stomach. Something wasn't right. The Varathians weren't just pushing forward. They were outmaneuvering them. They were adapting. Hawk's eyes locked onto the figures darting across the valley floor. The enemy was moving faster now, closer to the perimeter, exploiting the weaknesses they'd identified. Their tactics had shifted from brute force to precision strikes. They were forcing the humans into a kill zone, a trap from which there would be no escape. Hawk had known the fight would escalate, but he hadn't expected this level of strategy. It was one thing to fight an enemy that charged head-on. It was another to fight an enemy that could think 3 steps ahead. Bull, status report. Hawk barked into his comms, pulling himself to his feet. The sergeant's heavy breathing came through the radio, along with the sound of rapid gunfire. Taking heavy fire from the south, Commander. We're holding, but not for long, Bull replied. They've got cloaked snipers on the ridgelines. I can't get a clean shot. We're pinned down. Hawk cursed under his breath. They were good, too good. The Varathians were outflanking them with surgical precision. But Hawk had one thing they didn't: experience. Sarah, take the east side. Lay down suppressive fire. Keep them off Bull's position. I'm going to hit their flank. I need you to cover me. Roger that, Sarah responded, her voice steady but laced with the underlying tension that Hawk could hear even through the static. She was good under pressure, but even she couldn't hold off an entire army. On my 6, Commander, Bull added, his tone thick with determination. We're not going anywhere. Hawk's lips curled into a brief smile. He trusted his men, but he knew that this wasn't just about them anymore. The enemy was too advanced, too ruthless. This fight wasn't about holding the outpost. It was about sending a message. Hawk wasn't sure if humanity could win, but he knew they had to make the Varathians regret ever thinking they were invincible. With one final glance at his team, Hawk sprinted toward the narrow gap between the shattered walls. The ground was littered with the corpses of the fallen, human and alien alike. The stench of death was thick in the air, but Hawk didn't flinch. He had learned long ago to ignore the horror around him, to focus on the mission. The sniper fire was immediate, crackling through the air like the sharp snap of a whip. Hawk dropped to the ground, rolling to the side to avoid the incoming shots. His mind worked faster than his body, anticipating the sniper's next move. He was already 2 steps ahead. Hawk popped up from behind cover, rifle raised. He spotted the glint of the Varathian's cloaked armor just in time, his trigger finger pulling the trigger without hesitation. The sniper dropped, his cloak flickering out of existence as the energy shield failed. Hawk didn't stop to watch. He was already moving, keeping his eyes on the shifting enemy forces. He rounded the corner of the outpost's southern wall, finding himself face to face with the elite Varathian Commandos. There were at least 10 of them, fully armored and ready for battle, their weapons raised. Hawk was outnumbered, but he didn't hesitate. He fired first, his rifle a blur of motion as he picked off one alien after another. The first fell to the ground in a crumpled heap, then another, their advanced armor crumpling under the force of the bullets. The rest returned fire immediately, their weapons crackling with energy as they unleashed a barrage of plasma. Hawk dove behind a wrecked vehicle, feeling the heat of the blasts as they tore through the air around him. He wasn't just fighting for survival now. He was fighting to prove something to himself, to his team, and to the enemy. The Varathians didn't flinch. Their armor absorbed the blast, their movements too precise, too calculated. They weren't human. They didn't feel fear. They didn't feel pain. But Hawk did. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the blood rushing in his ears, the sweat stinging his eyes. He was alive, and he was going to make sure they knew just how dangerous a cornered Green Beret could be. His rifle clicked empty. Hawk didn't pause. He threw it to the side and pulled his sidearm, ducking low as the Varathians advanced, their movements synchronized and deliberate. They had him surrounded, their weapons trained on him from every angle. There was no escape. But Hawk wasn't done yet. "Bull!" he shouted into the comms, the urgency in his voice clear. "Now's the time." There was no response, but Hawk didn't need one. Bull and Sarah had done their part, buying him just enough time to get in close, to do what he needed to do. He reached for the small explosive charge strapped to his vest, his fingers flying over the controls. A second later, a deafening blast rang out as the charges Sarah had planted detonated, sending a massive wave of debris crashing toward the Varathian squad. The force of the explosion knocked two of them off their feet, and Hawk didn't waste a second. He lunged forward, taking out the nearest alien with a precise shot to the head. The others scrambled to regain their footing, but Hawk was already moving, faster than they could react. The remaining Varathians fired blindly, their energy blasts missing by mere inches as Hawk closed the distance between them. He was in their face now, his knife in his hand. One of the aliens lunged at him with a plasma blade, but Hawk was already one step ahead. He sidestepped the strike, driving his blade deep into the alien's neck. The creature's energy shield flickered, then shattered as the knife found its mark. Hawk didn't stop. He kept moving, faster, relentless. He fought like an animal, fueled by pure instinct and the need to survive. The last of the Commandos fell, their weapons clattering to the ground. Hawk stood over them, chest heaving, blood dripping from his hands, but there was no time to revel in the victory. The rest of the Varathian forces were closing in, and Hawk could already hear the hum of their cloaked ships overhead. They were regrouping, preparing for the next wave. But Hawk wasn't done. He hadn't even started. The outpost was still standing, barely, but Hawk knew they wouldn't last much longer. He had no illusions about that. He had made a dent in the enemy's forces, but it wasn't enough. The Varathians had underestimated him. They'd underestimated humanity. And that mistake, it was going to cost them. As Hawk turned toward his men, his heart still pounding with the heat of the battle, he knew the true fight was only just beginning. And whatever happened next, he was going to make sure the Varathians remembered the day they met a Green Beret. With a grim smile, Hawk moved forward, ready for the next round. The crackle of static in Hawk's ear was the only sound that broke the thick, suffocating silence. The battlefield was eerily still now, the usual chaos and clamor of combat replaced by the heavy, almost oppressive quiet that followed the storm. But Hawk knew better than to trust silence. It was the calm before the final storm. The Varathians were regrouping, and they would come back stronger. They always did. Hawk crouched behind the wreckage of a once mighty defense tower, his rifle in hand, eyes scanning the horizon. His team was spread out, each soldier tucked away in the wreckage, ready to strike when the time was right. The enemy was too clever, too relentless. They wouldn't give up so easily, not after taking such heavy losses. Hawk had already seen that. The Varathians didn't just want to conquer. They wanted to break their enemies, to instill fear, to send a message. And Hawk knew that message was coming for him and his team. "Commander, they're closing in." Sarah's voice was calm but tense, betraying her own unease. "I can hear the engines. They're sending reinforcements." Hawk glanced at the sky, just as a shadow crossed the horizon. A fleet of Varathian ships, sleek and deadly, descended from the clouds. The familiar hum of their cloaking devices filled the air, but Hawk knew the ships were visible to his trained eyes. They were cloaked, but not invincible. "They're not going to get another chance," Hawk muttered to himself. He turned to Bull, who was crouched nearby, his heavy weapon at the ready. The hulking sergeant gave him a grim nod. "We're ready, sir," Bull said. His voice, like always, was thick with grit and determination. The man didn't flinch, not even in the face of insurmountable odds. Hawk looked over his team, Sarah, Bull, the others, all battle-hardened, all willing to die for the mission. The Varathians were powerful, but they were about to learn that humanity had a strength they couldn't anticipate: the will to survive, the will to fight until there was nothing left to give. The ships were descending now, their sleek bodies cutting through the air like deadly phantoms. Hawk's pulse quickened, but he didn't move. Not yet. He wasn't about to let the enemy dictate the terms of this fight. Not when he had a plan. "Sarah, Bull, you're on the west flank," Hawk ordered. "When I give a signal, we hit them from both sides. Don't let them surround us. We need to keep them off balance." "Got it." Sarah's voice was sharp. Hawk could hear the familiar tension in her tone. This wasn't just any mission. This was personal. They had bled together on this hellish world, and now they had to finish it. He turned back toward the descending ships. The Varathians were almost within range. He could see them now, moving with the precision of predators, their cloaking devices flickering out of sight as they prepare to land. Hawk wasn't waiting around. He gave the order. Now, it was a blur of movement. Hawk and his team erupted from their positions, weapons blazing, as they tore into the first wave of Varathian soldiers. The aliens were fast, too fast, but Hawk was faster. His rifle spat fire as he dropped one after another. The Varathians fired back, their plasma weapons crackling with energy, but Hawk had already calculated their movements. He knew where they would be before they did. He dove into the fray, rolling to the side to avoid a blast, his rifle never wavering as he gunned down another alien soldier. They were relentless, but Hawk was more than that. He was human, and that meant something. It meant the ability to adapt, to think on the fly, to exploit the smallest of weaknesses and turn them into a weapon. "Bull, suppressive fire," Hawk shouted as he ducked behind a ruined wall, narrowly avoiding another blast. Bull's heavy weapon erupted in a deafening roar, sending a hail of rounds into the Varathians. They faltered, their formations momentarily disrupted. But they regrouped quickly, like a well-oiled machine, their armor shimmering in the light of the blasts. Hawk was moving again, already closing the gap. He was close now, too close for the Varathians to react. He could see the fear in their eyes, the realization that they had underestimated their enemies. The fight was far from over, but Hawk could feel the tide shifting. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for something bigger, for the future, for humanity's place in the galaxy. "Sarah, on my 6, Hawk growled into the comms, his voice fierce as he sprinted toward the heart of the enemy formation. "We're going in." As he closed in on the remaining Varathians, Hawk felt a rush of adrenaline. The battle had become a blur of motion, blood, sweat, and the acrid scent of gunpowder hanging thick in the air. He was focused only on the task at hand, his every move precise, calculated. But even as he charged, even as he fought, part of him knew this wouldn't be the final battle. The Varathians would return. They always did, but they would remember this fight. They would remember the humans who stood their ground and fought back. "On your 6, Commander," Sarah called out, her voice steady as ever, even as her rifle barked in the background. "We've got you covered." Hawk grinned, his heart pounding. He didn't need them to cover him. He was the one leading this charge, but it was the solidarity of his team that kept him grounded. It was the humanity in them that would win this fight, and they were going to make sure the Varathians knew it. The final stretch was a blur. Hawk moved like lightning, his rifle snapping up to fire with precision. Each shot was a promise. They weren't just fighting to survive. They were fighting to show the Varathians that they could never win. The Varathians may have been stronger, smarter, and more advanced, but humanity had something they could never understand: the strength to keep fighting when all seemed lost, the will to defy. Finally, as the last of the Varathians fell, Hawk stood over them, chest heaving, his blood still boiling from the battle. The air was thick with the stench of death and smoke, but there was no time to revel in the victory. They had won this round, but Hawk knew the war wasn't over. The Varathians wouldn't forget this fight, and they would return with vengeance. "Good work, team," Hawk said, his voice low but full of pride. "But we're not done yet." He turned away from the battlefield, his team following close behind. The fight wasn't over, but they had sent a message. And the next time the Varathians came, they would remember the day they fought an American Green Beret. And they would remember what it meant to face humanity at its most dangerous.